Bienvenidos al Cerebro Creativo. El Cerebro Creativo hace parte de la iniciativa Cerebro y Aprendizajes, un coloquio anual organizado por el Colegio Hacienda Los Alcaparros desde el 2017. En contados instantes, daremos inicio a la conferencia ¿Qué es la mente creativa?, con el Dr. Roger E. Beaty, investigador principal del Laboratorio Creativo de Neurociencia Cognitiva de la Universidad de Penn State. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Les presentamos a Rosita Caro, fundadora y directora del Colegio Hacienda Los Alcaparros.
Buenos días, nos encontramos aquí en la segunda conferencia del evento del Cerebro Creativo, que es el tema de este año para nuestra reflexión sobre cerebros y aprendizajes. Tengo como siempre el honor de ofrecer esta iniciativa del Colegio Hacienda Los Alcaparros y le doy la bienvenida a todos los rectores que nos acompañan de la UCB, de Unpoli, de otros colegios, a las comunidades de profesores que se unen a este evento como una manera de actualizarse en educación y de ponerse en contacto con las últimas investigaciones, a los padres de familia del colegio que saben que en licencia este evento es preparado para ellos, sus hijos, y a nuestros maravillosos profesores del Colegio Hacienda Los Alcaparros. Este año hemos tocado realmente un tema central y de interés total para el mundo, que es el tema de la creatividad y sobre todo de la posibilidad que tenemos como educadores de darle un viraje a nuestros proyectos educativos para darle una prioridad a la propuesta de los niños, a la posibilidad de nuestros jóvenes de crear un mundo mejor. Por eso el cerebro creativo ha tenido una inmensa acogida en diferentes partes del mundo y de diferentes investigadores que quieren acompañarnos en esta, digamos, en esta gesta por la creatividad de los niños, por la creatividad de los países, por la creatividad de todas las personas para el diseño de un mundo innovador, mejor, con posibilidades para todas las personas de resolver problemas, de dar nuevas respuestas, de abrir nuevos caminos hacia un futuro. También hoy hacemos nuestro segundo llamado a la participación en la iniciativa de las ideas globales de creatividad. El doctor Beaty nos va a ampliar un poco esa idea. Obviamente, pues me corresponde el honor de presentar al doctor Roger Beaty, quien además de todas las investigaciones que ha hecho en el campo de la neuropsicología y además de entregar, digamos, un conocimiento muy importante para la transformación de la pedagogía, es pianista de jazz, de manera que en sí mismo es un creativo. Su propia investigación científica es un esfuerzo inmensamente creativo por poner en contacto la psicología, la ciencia y la educación, y seguramente ustedes van a encontrar, como encontré yo en sus escritos y en sus entrevistas, una posibilidad de pensar, una posibilidad de renovar nuestras maneras de enseñar, teniendo en cuenta el potencial que nos da la investigación y el potencial que nos da particularmente los hallazgos que ha hecho el doctor Beaty en relación con imaginación, memoria, creatividad y futuro. Les presento al doctor Roger Beaty. Bienvenido, Roger. Muchísimas gracias por estar acá. Te dejo entonces con esta magnífica audiencia, que es la audiencia de la iniciativa de cerebros y aprendizajes del Colegio Hacienda Los Alcaparros. Bienvenido.
Thank you, Rosa, for that very kind introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all today. I am very excited to talk to you all about the research that I have been doing over the years on the psychology and neuroscience of creativity. So to get started, I just want to talk about some of the questions that have really motivated my research over the years. And maybe the biggest question is, how does the brain produce creative thought? Where do creative ideas come from? How does the brain put together new information to help us solve new problems? And to what extent does creativity rely on memory? So we have to learn new information and rely on our memories to some extent to help us solve problems, but are there sometimes that memory can kind of get in the way and prevent us from thinking creatively? And also, is the creative brain wired differently? And that is from a kind of an individual perspective, are there different patterns of wiring in the brain that are more or less conducive to thinking creatively? And also something I've been thinking about more recently is how does education impact creative thinking? So what is the role of the school in shaping creative minds? And so just to kind of start off with an overview of my presentation today, I'll kind of kick things off with a discussion of the creative mind. So more on the psychology and thinking processes that are associated with creativity and how we have been measuring creativity in our scientific research. And also I'll then talk about the neuroscience of creativity, so the creative brain and what we have discovered about the brain patterns that are associated with creative thinking. And then I'll talk more about the role of memory, more specifically in the role, in its role in creative thinking. And then I'll close talking about the relationships between learning and creativity and some recent studies we've been doing in classrooms. So to start things off, talking about some background information. So in the research that the field that I come from, people often define creativity as the ability to produce something that is new and useful. So something that didn't exist before, but also helps us to solve a specific problem. And as I'll talk more about shortly, In the creativity literature and in research, divergent thinking tasks are often used to measure creativity. And these thinking tasks are useful for researchers because performance on them tends to correlate with performance or people's self-reported creative behavior and achievement. So doing well on these tests tends to correlate with actually doing creative things in the real world. So more about divergent thinking, which I'll be kind of focusing mostly on today. So this is a kind of a specific form of thinking that is relevant for creativity. And basically it is the ability to generate or come up with ideas that diverge from a given concept or starting point. So it's coming up with a bunch of different ideas or associations. And there's different tests that researchers use to measure divergent thinking. Some of them are verbal, they have to do with words, and others are more drawing based or visual spatial. And so you can see here, this is an example of one of the tests where people are shown just different lines, and then they use that as a starting point to draw something. And divergent thinking is thought to differ to some extent from convergent thinking in that there's no correct answer. So with convergent thinking, you're trying to converge on a single correct solution or an optimal solution. And to illustrate some of the tests that have been used in the psychology and neuroscience literature, I will show you one example of a convergent thinking task. This is called remote associates task. And here people are shown 3 words like pine, crab, and sauce. And they're asked to think of a familiar compound word or phrase that can link these words. So think of a 4th word that is related to all of those 3. And for those that want to play along at home, I'll give you some time to think about this one. Okay, so the correct answer in this case is apple. So pineapple, crab, apple, applesauce. So as I mentioned, this is a form of convergent creative thinking when you have to think of the correct solution to one problem. You have to converge on one type of solution. And this is an interesting type of creative thinking. And it allows us to study things like insight. So the insight moment when you have an aha experience. And I'm actually going to be focusing a little bit less on this type of creative thinking today and more on divergent thinking, which is the ability, again, to think of different ideas that diverge from a given starting point or concept or object in this case. So one common task that is used is called the alternative uses task. And here people are presented with different common everyday objects and asked to think of creative ways to use them that are not the common way of using the object. And again, if you want to play along at home, I welcome you to do that. So think of creative ways to use this object that's not the standard way of using it. Okay, and I will just show you some example ideas that I've seen in some of my research over the years. So some people will say you can use a brick to build a house, which is really the common way of using it. Sometimes people still say that as a response. Other people might say you could use it as a doorstop, right? So this is kind of different from the common or standard use of the object, but maybe something people have seen before in their lives. Some people have said to use it as an exfoliator. So this is definitely something that is not the typical way of using the object, but maybe not the most pleasant use of the object. And other people have said things like you can grind it up and make a filtering substance. So you can see that there's a range of different ideas people come up with on this task, and it kind of just gives us insight into how people use their memory and different thinking processes to come up with ideas. Okay, so now I want to talk more about different theories that have been proposed on the creative mind over the years, and one of which is called the Associative Theory. And this is the idea that creative thinking involves spontaneously connecting concepts in semantic memory. And so I'll be talking about different types of memory, and one form of memory I'm going to be talking about now is semantic memory, and that is our memory for concepts and facts and things that we have learned over time. And they're thought to be represented in like an interconnected network of things that are related to each other in different ways. So here's just a toy example of concepts that are related. You can see that they're kind of closer to each other, and colors here and different fruits. And so this is just an example of kind of how concepts are learned, and then how they're represented in our memories, and then how we go from there to kind of connect them to help us think of creative ideas. And there has been some research showing that people differ in their organization of their semantic networks. And this actually plays a role in their ability to think creatively, because if you think about it, if you are trying to make connections between two concepts that are far apart, if you have a semantic memory system where those kind of concepts are actually tending to be more closely related, then it might be easier to connect them when you're trying to think creatively. And so that is one theory that has been proposed, and it's been around for some time. And more recently, researchers have been thinking about the role of different kind of controlled, or what's called executive functions, different aspects of thinking that help us to kind of direct and control the contents of our minds, right? So there's a theory that creative thinking involves the ability to control cognition and these different executive functions. And here's just some examples of these executive functions, things like controlling attention, monitoring cognitive flexibility, working memory. So again, these are just different aspects of thinking that allow us to try to have some level of control over the direction of our thought. And in general, executive functions help us to regulate our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. If we want to think about something else and we're using that's not what we're currently thinking about, that's when we would use these more executive functions. And this kind of ability to control our cognition may help to manage the interference that would come to mind when people are thinking creatively. So oftentimes when we're thinking creatively, the first things that come to mind are the things that we already know, right? So that's our memory kind of giving us information, but it tends to give us information about things that we've already learned, right? And so the ability to kind of think about something differently, or kind of shift the way that you're thinking, is where these different cognitive skills may be coming into play. Okay, and this theory is kind of different from the associative theory that I just mentioned, because the associative theory kind of says that you're just kind of spontaneously connecting concepts just as they're activated in your memory. And this theory is more saying that we can kind of have some level of control and direction in that creative thought process. And so instead of saying that maybe it's just one theory is right or the other theory is right, researchers have talked about how we can think about both types of theories being relevant. So thinking about creativity as a combination of these associative processes where you're just combining and activating concepts, but then also the ability to kind of have some level of control in that creative process. And so we did some research a few years ago, or several years ago by now, where we found that both kinds of thinking styles, so both the associative and the kind of more executive controlled, was predictive of people's performance on divergent thinking tasks. So it wasn't just the kind of spontaneous thinking, and it wasn't more just the control thinking, it was kind of both of them that were contributing to people's ability to think creatively. And when I did this research back in 2014, it raised the question in my mind about how this was actually working in the brain. So we know something about the creative mind through these studies. How do these processes actually unfold in the brain? And that brings me to the second part of my talk, where I'll talk about some of the research that we have done on the creative brain. Okay, and so one thing I just wanted to introduce to everyone is a brain network model that I've been developing to try to understand creative cognition or creative thinking. And so I'm just going to kind of walk through the different networks in our brain that have been associated with creative thinking. So one of the networks is called the default mode network, or the default network. And so this is a set of brain regions that are generally active when we are remembering a past experience using our memory, imagining a future experience that hasn't happened yet, and other things like mind wandering. So it's kind of more spontaneous aspects of thinking, or kind of looking inward. And in terms of possible creative functions that this network might be serving, it could be things like brainstorming, just kind of coming up with different ideas, and also simulating possibilities that are relevant to a creative goal. Okay, so that's one network that seems to be relevant for creative thinking. Another one is called the executive control network. And in general, this network plays a role in those executive functions that I mentioned a few slides ago, kind of focusing our attention and being more directed in our thinking processes. And in terms of possible creative functions, so when we're trying to solve creative problems, this brain network may play a general role in helping us to kind of evaluate our ideas, or, as I mentioned before, kind of blocking out the ideas that aren't very creative and then redirecting our thought processes. And a third network that has been associated with creative thinking over the years is called the Salience Network. And again, we're talking about just different regions in the brain that work together here. And the Salience Network plays a general role in switching between the default network and the executive network. And it's generally important for picking up important information that we see in the environment, or actually internally as well from our thoughts. And in terms of possible creative functions, the Salience Network may be playing a role in identifying promising ideas. So if the default network is kind of generating ideas, maybe the Salience Network is picking up on those that are promising and helping to then shift things over to the more controlled stage of thinking, which is more of the executive network. So just maybe switching between this generative and evaluative mode of thinking. Okay, so just different networks in the brain that we think might be important for creative thinking. But if you think about what these networks seem to be generally involved in, right? So the column where I was talking about the general role of our general function of these networks. What we have seen for some time in the research literature is that those networks, specifically the default and executive networks, they don't usually work together, right? So when one is working and doing something, the other one is not, and vice versa. So if you think about it, if you're just kind of thinking to yourself and mind wandering, that's a very kind of default network kind of activity. And so that network would be kind of activated in your brain, and the network that's associated with trying to control your thoughts or being focused is less activated. And then vice versa, if you're trying to focus, the executive network might be more activated. You're trying to solve problems, you're working on something challenging, but then you wouldn't necessarily want the default network to be activated then, because that's associated with mind wandering, and maybe those thoughts are kind of distracting and getting in the way, right? So we have this kind of opposing relationship between the networks in general. But if you look at the neuroscience of the creative brain in the literature, you can see that the studies will show activation of these different areas, right? When people are thinking creatively in a brain scanner, some of the regions in the executive network are activated, and some of the regions in the default network are activated. And so that was kind of a paradox or a puzzle that I was curious about several years ago, and it raised the question in my mind about how these networks may be interacting. So not just is one area lighting up in the brain scanner or another, but are they exchanging information? So kind of what's called functional connectivity. And we did a study on this right now. I'm going to show a bunch of brain scans, but basically what we did here is we put people in an fMRI scanner, so a large scanner that we use for research, and asked them to think of creative uses for objects, so that divergent thinking test I mentioned earlier. And we found different brain regions that were connected to other areas during that task. So when people were thinking creatively, we found a bunch of different areas that were showing some different connectivity pattern. And we focused on one of the areas of the default network that I mentioned earlier, which is shown in this arrow right here. And then we asked, what other areas is that region talking to when people are thinking creatively? And we found that it was a lot of the areas in the other networks that I just mentioned that are more associated with controlled aspects of thinking. So more frontal areas here shown in this panel. And then we asked if there was a difference in the connectivity patterns over time. So when people are starting to think of ideas, do they show a different relationship between these networks compared to later when they've already been thinking about it for a little bit? And what we found is that at the very beginning of the task, the posterior cingulate, which is part of the default network that I mentioned, was showing more communication with these areas in the more frontal mid part of the brain called the insula, which are part of the Salience Network. And then later down, when people were thinking about their ideas, this area of the default network was more connected to like more frontal areas of the brain. And the way we interpreted this is that when people are first starting to think of ideas, they kind of use their default network to draw on memory, and then maybe that Salience network picks up on something that might be promising, grabs that information, and then kind of sends it over to the front part of the brains that are more involved in evaluating creative thoughts. All right, and what we did to follow up on this, so what I've shown so far is just kind of general divergent thinking, uses for objects, right? That's just one way of thinking about how people might be coming up with ideas. And so we actually looked at this very recently in the context of scientific creative thinking. So you could think about science as the scientific process itself as creative. You think about things like designing experiments, that's a creative process in itself, and coming up with different research questions and hypotheses. So these different kind of thinking skills that are creative in a scientific context. We ask the question, do similar brain networks support people's ability to think creatively in this scientific context? And we found that yes, so far we are showing that in a brain scanner when people are thinking of creative hypotheses, this shows the same kind of brain connectivity pattern that we were showing before with the divergent thinking task. So it seems that these three networks that I've been talking about may be supporting creativity across domains. So not just verbal divergent thinking, but also creative thinking in a science context. And this is actually something that has been shown in the arts for some time. So since 2016, we wrote a paper summarizing the findings of studies that have looked at artists in brain scanners. So this is some pictures of musicians and visual artists in brain scanners doing their creative thing. So, and what these studies have found is that a similar pattern of brain network connectivity was showing up in people's brains when the musicians were improvising in this case, and then also when the visual artists were drawing out ideas and evaluating them. But what these studies found is that there's different patterns of brain connectivity depending on whether people are coming up with ideas in the first place or trying to kind of more evaluate them and refine them a little bit more. And the connectivity pattern was more associated with the more evaluative parts of creative thinking. And the way we interpreted this at the time is that this network coupling of the default and executive networks may depend on the extent to which you have a specific goal that you're trying to achieve when you're thinking creatively. So in the context of the music improvisation study at the top here, where we have someone improvising in a brain scanner, in this study, they were asked to improvise new melodies based on a specific emotional concept, like joy, sadness, those kind of things, and then to come up with new melodies to convey that emotion. And so that would be, you might think about improvisation as a very spontaneous kind of process. And that's something that, as I mentioned already, the default network plays a role in, kind of more spontaneous aspects of thinking. But in this case, musicians were asked to improvise based on a specific emotion. So as they're playing and improvising, coming up with new melodies, they kind of have to keep in mind that they want it to sound like something. So instead of just playing anything randomly, you kind of have this goal in mind that you want your performance to sound a specific kind of way, right? So kind of keeping that goal active in your mind as you're doing something that is otherwise more spontaneous, you might tend to see these networks communicating more, the more controlled executive and the spontaneous default network. Okay, so now to look more at how people vary in these brain networks. So what I've been talking about so far is just looking at people on the average. You could also look at individual differences, so how people differ in their creative thinking skills and how that's related to their brain networks that might be relevant for creative thinking. And what we found in the study I told you about, the first study I told you about, is that divergent thinking ability was correlated with the efficiency of information processing within the default network. I'm sorry, within the three networks that I had mentioned already. So people that could more easily connect those dots in their brain, those regions that were relevant for creative thinking, tended to come up with more original ideas. Okay, and this raised the question of whether the creative brain is wired differently. So people that have different kinds of creative thinking skills, is there a kind of a certain pattern in the brain of connectivity that is helpful for when people are trying to solve creative problems? And we did a study that was like the first one I had mentioned, where people were in the brain scanner thinking of creative uses for objects. We scanned many more people this time. We scanned about 163 people. And we found what we called a high creative network. And this is a set of regions here shown in this brain scan that were predictive of people's the creative quality of the ideas they were coming up with. So basically we searched throughout the brain and we were trying to find which regions were most correlated with, or kind of explaining people's creative thinking scores on this test. And we found out of all of the regions and connections that we were looking at, that the most important ones were the ones that were across those three networks I mentioned, so default, salience, and executive. And we didn't just show this in one study, we showed it in a bunch of other studies. So we kind of discovered this network in our original study and then kind of tested it in other people from different countries and found that it was kind of a universal connectivity pattern that was predicting people's ability to think creatively on this task. And this, the kind of takeaway from this is that the creative brain is kind of wired differently, at least in terms of divergent thinking. So trying to think about this skill of thinking of abilities. People with stronger connections tend to produce more original ideas. And I think this is an important point for education as we think about how different educational practices might be influencing these brain patterns. Okay, and now I'm going to talk more about the role of memory in creativity. So I've talked about different creativity theories and the creative mind and what we found for the creative brain. So now I want to talk more about memory more specifically and how that seems to be important for creativity. Okay, so I already talked about earlier a little bit this concept of semantic memory, right? So semantic memory is our organization of facts and concepts and words that we have learned and knowledge over the years and how it's represented in these networks in our minds. And again, the more two concepts share these semantic properties, or they're more similar, the more kind of links between them. Again, this idea of spreading activation, which is essentially when, if you're thinking about one concept, it's kind of spontaneously activates other concepts in your memory network. Other things that are related to it kind of just kind of pop up in mind. And again, as I had mentioned earlier, creative thinking involves connecting remote concepts. So you think about remote concepts, and this is just a toy example of what one memory network might look like for the concept of creativity. So you have a bunch of other words and these concepts that are associated with the central concept of creativity. And if you want to say something original about the concept of creativity in this way, you would maybe be wanting to connect ideas or concepts that are far apart, right? So here's painting over here and brain on this side, and the concepts are generally organized in a way where they're more related to each other. Again, this is just an example of the concept of creativity. And as I mentioned earlier, people differ in how they have these concepts organized and in their memories. And if they can have things organized more kind of closely together, then it might be more helpful when they're trying to think creatively and come up with these remote ideas. You know, this way of thinking about creativity and memory suggests that memory is very important, at least semantic memory. We need to have information stored in our memories to pull it out and to help us combine ideas and think creatively. But as I mentioned earlier, there's times when concepts kind of pop into mind. The things that we know really well from memory are kind of maybe getting in the way as a source of interference when we're trying to think of new ideas. And so this raises the question of how the brain might be overcoming this source of interference. So when we want to kind of think about something differently and not kind of focus on the associations and ideas that we already know, what is our brain doing when we're trying to move away from what we already know? And so I'm just going to walk you through the experiment that we did to test this. We put people again in a brain scanner. So they're laying in a brain scanner and doing this experiment. And they're seeing different instructions on the screen while they're getting their brain scanned. And in this study, we presented them with noun and verb pairs. So they were just studying different noun and verb associations, things that are really related, like shoe and walk, cup and drink, phone and talk. So these are concepts that most people would think are related to each other. And so they were the participants in our study were just kind of studying those associations. And then we asked them to tell us what the associations were that they studied. And this is called cued recall. So we showed the noun and asked them to tell us what the verb was that they studied with it. And the point of this was to really strengthen that connection between the two words. So that in the third part of the study, people were asked to think creatively. So we showed them some of the words that they had studied, and then we showed them some new words, and we asked them to think of creative associations. And so this allowed us to look at what's going on in the brain when people have to overcome the associations and ideas from their memory that they already know, and compare that to a condition where they're coming up with something new and they don't have as much old information coming from memory. Okay. What we found here is that when people had to overcome the ideas that they had already studied, those ideas tended to be less semantically distant or less creative. So the old information was coming to mind and kind of disrupting the creative thought process. If you look at what's happening in the brain here, you can see a lot of the same regions that I had mentioned earlier from this default, executive, and Salience networks were lighting up in the brain when people were doing this task, specifically more when they had to overcome what they had already studied before and think about something new. And there's a lot of brain images on here, but the important one is the one that's boxed in red here, where we found that if you look at the communication between the networks, those default and executive networks were more exchanging information more when people were having to kind of overcome what they had already studied before. And the way we thought about this is that maybe this default network isn't involved in activating old memories, and the control network, the executive network, is more trying to block that from mind, or kind of shift away so we can think about something differently. So just thinking about here, the idea is that semantic memory can sometimes be a constraint. So we need semantic memory in order to draw on it to help us solve problems. In this case, we're showing that sometimes memory can get in the way from helping us to think creatively. All right, so I've been talking a lot about semantic memory so far, our knowledge for facts, concepts, words. I'm going to talk more now about episodic memory. And episodic memory is our own kind of personal memories about our past experiences. So this is, you can think about it like the people, places, and actions, and the things that we've experienced in our lives. I like to say, for example, that to distinguish between semantic and episodic memory, I live in Pennsylvania in the United States, and a semantic memory would be that the capital of Pennsylvania is Harrisburg, right? That's a semantic thing that I have learned that's in my memory. But you could also, for episodic memory, I could think about the last time that I visited Harrisburg and what was happening, what I did, the people I was with, and all of that stuff, right? So this is a distinction between episodic memories, our own memories for our experiences, and semantic being knowledge and words and concepts. Okay. And the thing about episodic memory is that it's thought to be reconstructive. So when we're trying to remember something, the theory is that we don't just remember it exactly how it was experienced from the moment it happened to the moment it stopped happening. It's thought to be more of a kind of grabbing information from memory and putting it together, reconstructing it in a way that kind of resembles how that experience happened in the first place. Okay, so not just kind of a video recorder where you press play and it's going to just play the entire memory, but more kind of a combination process where you're putting the pieces back together. And episodic memory is thought to play a role in our ability to imagine the future. So not just remember what happened to us, but to imagine what could happen to us in the future. And this relationship between memory and imagination has been studied for many decades now. And it was first established in the 1980s by a researcher who was working with patients who suffered from amnesia. So people who had a hard time remembering what happened to them in their past. And what the researchers found is that these same individuals who had a hard time remembering their past also had a hard time imagining what was going to happen to them in the future. So if you ask what we're going to do tonight or next week or next month, these people had trouble doing that. And that was suggesting to researchers at the time that the same brain regions might be involved in not just remembering the past, but also imagining the future. And since then, there have been many brain imaging studies that have kind of shown the same brain areas lighting up when people are remembering the past and imagining the future. This is just a cartoon example of somebody in a brain scanner. And one time they're remembering experience of taking a summer vacation to the beach. And another time they're imagining picking out a puppy at a pet shop next year. So just showing different cases when people are remembering what happened to them in the past and also imagining something that hasn't happened yet. Okay, and so as I mentioned, the same brain regions have been shown to be involved in both of these kinds of thinking. And there's a specific kind of experiment that you can do to see if this memory system that's involved in helping us to remember our past experiences also is involved in other kinds of thinking processes. It's called an episodic specificity induction. I'll just briefly tell you how this works. And so this is something that researchers will do in an experiment, and they'll ask people to come into the lab, and they'll show them a short 2-minute video clip. So people will watch that video clip, they'll do some other task, and then this is the important part, is that the researcher will ask the participant to remember as much as they can about what they saw in the video. This is the episodic induction. And the idea here is that it's really engaging the memory processes involved in kind of getting information from our memories to activate those same kind of thinking processes involved. And then afterwards, if you want to see, does this episodic system support other kinds of thinking processes, then you can give participants another cognitive task afterwards. So basically, this just kind of activates people's memory system, and then you can see if activating that memory system influences how people perform on another thinking task. Okay, you just compare that to a control condition in this kind of experiment. And what was found here, actually kind of looking at this in terms of creative thinking. So a lot of researchers, as I mentioned, have been really focusing on semantic memory. It's been unclear until recently whether episodic memory, so our own memory for past experiences, is relevant for creative thinking. That hasn't actually been established until recently, and this is something that has been shown in 2015. There was a study where they did that episodic induction procedure, then gave people divergent thinking tasks, and found that activating this memory system helped people come up with more ideas on a divergent task, but it didn't impact their performance on other tasks. So it was something specific about divergent thinking in general that was being influenced by this episodic induction. So suggesting that people are drawing on past experiences and using those same thinking processes when they're trying to think creatively. And we did another study on this using fMRI brain scanning. So people did the same thing. They were in the scanner, they watched a video. We asked them to tell us as much about that video as they can. And then we looked at what was going on in their brain when they were thinking creatively afterwards. And we found that an area of the hippocampus, which I mentioned earlier, was activated when people were thinking creatively after they had received this induction of their episodic memory system. And this suggests that a brain region that is really important for memory also, which is the hippocampus, also supports our ability to not only imagine the future, but also to think creatively. All right, so now I would just like to summarize some of the findings that I've been talking about in terms of the creative brain. And just to say that a lot of our research, what we're finding is that these three networks, default, salience, and control, or executive control networks, dynamically interact, support creative thought. So there's networks in our brains, and they communicate when people are thinking creatively. The networks appear to support both general creative thinking and creativity in specific domains. So not just thinking of creative uses for objects, but also scientific creative thinking and creative thinking in the arts. Similar brain networks are involved. And we're also showing that people with stronger connections between the networks tend to come up with more original ideas. So the ability to, at the individual level, to kind of strengthen these connections is an interesting area for future research to focus on. We just kind of showed at one person at one day that their brain connectivity pattern was correlated with their creativity score, but it's something that we're trying to look at next is whether these connectivity patterns change over time with experience and with other interventions like education. And then in terms of memory, the default and executive networks that I've been talking about help us to overcome the unoriginal ideas that come to mind for memory. So when we're trying to think creatively, our memory can kind of give us information sometimes that's not so helpful. And these networks of the brain can help us to kind of think beyond what we already know. And as I was just mentioning, episodic memory supports creative thinking. Using that induction, we showed that that increased the number of ideas people had by activating the system of our memory that's involved in thinking about our own past experiences. And so that might tell us something about how creativity works in terms of combining aspects of our past experiences. And also the hippocampus supports our ability not only to remember things, this classic memory regions involved in memory, but also to imagine what hasn't happened yet. and to think creatively, which also is related to imagination. Okay, so now I wanted to talk about some more recent research we have done on learning and creativity. So this is a relatively new area of research for me, but it's something that I'm really excited in and would like to share with you today. So I think everyone here would agree that learning is important for creativity. We all want to kind of foster creativity in our students. But it's important to know in the first place that creative thinking is important for academic success. So we know creativity is important, but there's actually has been research showing that creative thinking skills are directly relevant for academic success. So doing better in school is related to creativity. This has been shown now in what's called a meta-analysis. So if you look at a bunch of different studies that have been done, you put them all together, they have found this, established this relationship between creative thinking and academic success. And in addition to just being important for academic success in school, creativity is also important for career success. Obviously, there's many different creative jobs out there, but what has been shown is that creativity, if you measure students' creativity when they're in school, you can kind of get a sense for later on in longitudinal studies how that is related to their future success. So creativity in middle school, for example, has been shown to predict later success in creative careers. So being more productive in a creative job. Okay, so creativity is important for academic success. It's also important for predicting future success. And I would like to kind of bring this question of learning and creativity down to kind of think about the creative mind and what I had mentioned earlier about semantic memory, right? So a lot of what has been shown that I talked about so far with learning and creativity is just correlations between creativity and school success. But kind of earlier in the talk, I had mentioned this idea of semantic memory being important for creativity. And again, this is our memory for facts and concepts. And we know that people who score higher on creativity tests have a more flexible memory network. So they have concepts that are more closely related to them. And it helps them to draw on when they're trying to think creatively. But I've been interested in the question of how these memory networks get to be shaped in the way that they are in the first place. So is there a potential role here for education and learning to intervene in kind of influencing how these networks are shaped in the classroom and over time? And does that then have an influence on students' creative thinking skills? And so we've looked at this in the context of comparing different schooling systems, so different educational practices. And we focused on just one type of schooling system here, which is the Montessori system, and compared that to a traditional system. And we found that that the Montessori students did show this kind of flexible semantic network structure where concepts were more closely together. And they also showed slightly higher performance on creative thinking tasks. And so this suggests that different educational practices can have an influence on the thinking styles that are important for creative thinking. And so this is just one study we've done so far. And again, it's just one example of a particular educational approach. There's many more studies that need to be done to kind of test how different educational practices and contribute to shaping the creative mind. And one possibility, kind of taking some lessons from what we might learn from Montessori, is that which is very kind of child-centered, working on hands-on projects in peer groups. Maybe this has something to do with explaining the differences that we're seeing. And I want to say that this is still kind of an early stage of research, so very kind of tentative interpretation. But it could be that kind of the way that concepts are learned in the classroom may influence then how they're represented in semantic networks, and then kind of how students are then accessing that information when they're trying to think creatively. And it could be that making these connections when learning kind of has it as a role then in influencing the organization of concepts. And again, potentially then how those concepts are retrieved from memory when people are trying to think creatively. Okay, so this is just one line of research that we're really excited in and hoping to do more about to try to see how different educational practices can influence the thinking skills relevant for creativity. Okay, and now I would like to tell you all about an exciting initiative here. The global call for creative ideas. Okay, so the world needs fresh and innovative ideas, and that's why we're asking you to participate in the global call for creative ideas. And we're asking people from all ages, from everywhere to take part. What we're looking for, again, is for you and what you think is the biggest problem facing humanity today. So it could be poverty, hunger, climate change, well-being, mental health. You can tell us. We encourage you to use your imagination, be creative and share your ideas, be bold, and potentially sharing even disruptive ideas. For those of you in the education field, particularly, we're asking you to think about what you see as the biggest problem in education and how we might fix it. Okay, to help with your creative process, we have created the Cerebro Creativo series of talks, and each talk in the series will help you develop your creative ideas, so don't miss out. We're hoping you'll be inspired to participate. You can join us, listen, ask questions to some of the world's leading experts on creativity. Okay, we're looking forward to receiving your ideas. As I said, everyone can participate from everywhere. Submissions are now open until May 31st, and you can register today and wait to submit your idea until May 31st, or you could even submit the idea now if you're excited about it. We'll then open voting on the ideas and pick out the ones that people think are the best, and that will be on June 14th. The selected ideas will be featured in the next edition of the Classroom Think Tank by Leonard Summer, who was our guest speaker a couple of weeks ago. You can send in a 5-minute video or 2-page photos or documents. It's up to you, just be creative. And everyone can join also, in addition to this initiative, a study that I'm running through Penn State, where we're interested in understanding more about how we can measure creativity. And so there's a link on the website, you can go to that, and it will send you to this short study where you can play some different creativity games. Okay, so that's all I have for today. I thank you all for being here and for your attention, and I'll be happy to take some questions.
Pues muchísimas gracias, Roger. Creo que todos tenemos nuestros cuadernos llenos de notas y estamos, el chat está lleno de preguntas y todos los profesores pues están interesados en el tema. Unos minutos antes de empezar con la sesión de preguntas, quiero presentar al doctor Jim Friedman, uno de las personas muy importantes en la UNESCO, en el proyecto de creatividad de la UNESCO, y al doctor David Eyman, que es profesor de creatividad e innovación en la Universidad de Miami. Ambos tienen para nosotros una maravillosa experiencia dentro de este proceso de la iniciativa del cerebro de aprendizajes y el cerebro creativo. Vamos a oír la amable invitación que nos van a hacer a las experiencias que ellos tienen y después haremos la sesión de preguntas. Gracias.
Thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
So we have a few moments here to talk to you about World Creativity Innovation Week, World Creativity and Innovation Day. We'd like to share with you a few things that we have happening through World Creativity and through a new program that David and I will be sharing with all of you around the world. World Creativity and Innovation Week was started in Canada back in the early 2000s by Marcy Siegel. She ran it from her home for a very long time until finally in 2017, the United Nations recognized World Creativity Innovation Day as an international day of observance. And so all over the world, people began to celebrate creativity in their lives, in their work, in their homes. And so a few years ago, we brought the world headquarters of World Creativity and Innovation Week here to Miami University, Oxford, Ohio, in the United States. And we are opening it up for everybody around the world to join us. You can find pretty much anything you need in World Creativity Innovation Week and Innovation Day at our website, wciw.org. And it is 69 days, 7 hours and 55 minutes away from our celebration. World Creativity and Innovation Week is April 15th through the 21st. And World Creativity and Innovation Day is April 21st. It is right now celebrated in 96 countries. And the 96 countries here around the world are here. Since we are being hosted today in Colombia, let me real quick grab here, show you that all you need to do is click on the Colombian flag and you will see the celebrations that are happening within Colombia. This is actually all the celebrations from this past year. And if you go on our website and you hit the red register button, you can tell us what you plan to be doing for World Creativity and Innovation Week. And we invite you, we encourage you, we welcome you. And if you have any questions, please reach out to us personally. We'd be happy to share our thoughts. David, what do we have going on our?
Well, we have another exciting opportunity. Before anything, I want to thank Roger that your research is the implication and applications are outstanding and well needed at this time of how we are evolving. So basically what Dr. Friedman and I are doing is we are putting together a few master classes, and I'm going to share a screen with you here, and I will share some links with you in a moment. These 3 classes, we are hoping that you might consider attending all 3. If you can only attend 1 or 2 of them, we fully understand they're freestanding opportunities. The first opportunity is Wednesday, March 2nd at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, which is, well, that would be 11 o'clock or 11:06 right now. To give you some context on that, the first session is 3 critical mindsets and C4, the creative explosion, which is a process developed at Miami University. That session will include some mostly exercises. Almost everything we do is exercise based. You will be in action, so please bring some scrap paper and bring some pens to write with and some post-it notes and that sort of thing, because you'll be doing some things. The second one, April 6th, 6 p.m., 3 more mindsets to build on creative confidence. What we are doing is we are putting together a series of mindsets, exploring all of them, how they relate to your life, and then together those mindsets will help build creative confidence. And then the third one is the entire creative package, your mindset, tool set, and skill set. If you attend all 3 of those, you will receive a certificate of completion that can be used for whatever it is that you needed on your bio or your CV. We're hoping that you will attend those, and we're looking forward to meeting everybody there. And that's it. Dr. Friedman?
I believe we have a few moments if anybody has some real quick questions for us before we turn it back over to Roger.
¿Tenemos alguna pregunta relacionada con el tema? Sofía.
World Creativity Week.
Have any questions at the moment, but will we see the global call on the World Creativity Week website?
Absolutely, we will.
Great.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Question and answer period.
Okay,
So
thank
much.
you.
Thank you, Jim.
Bueno, entonces vamos a hablar un poquito con Roger sobre su investigación. Tenemos interesantísimas preguntas en este momento sobre el tema. Vamos a esperar que Roger entre en pantalla. Listos. Entonces, hay muchas preguntas en este momento, Roger, que hacen mención a el tema de la edad de los niños. Dicen, si el proceso, digamos, de los variados procesos de network que se hacen en el cerebro van cambiando a través del tiempo, con la edad, y hay, digamos, en las investigaciones que ustedes han hecho, y si de ahí se podría derivar un poco que hay unas edades o unos momentos de la vida donde sería muy importante impulsar el tema de la creatividad. Entonces hay como un clúster de preguntas alrededor del tema de cómo evoluciona esos networks que se van creando en el cerebro.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question. It's something that I'm trying to study in my research that's ongoing in the future. I can say right now that the networks are important to a lot of different aspects of thinking that we already know about, right? So the memory and this kind of executive functions that I talked about, we know that they're developing, they're quite plastic and changing quite a bit when children are younger. We don't yet know how that change relates to the development of creativity. That research still needs to be done. That's something I'm very interested in learning about. I would say that, you know, like any other kind of skill that education is trying to foster, creativity is something that we do know can actually be impacted through different educational practices. As I mentioned, the one study that I've been involved in, there are others out there as well. So I would say that it's reasonable to think that there is a relationship between how these networks are developing and how creativity develops over time. We don't know what that relationship is yet. And we also don't know what I think is personally the most exciting, which is to look at how the schools are influencing the development of these networks, and then how that influences then creative thinking.
Uh-huh. El estudio acerca de los estilos, digamos, de enseñanza y cómo influencia, aunque es un primer estudio entre Montessori, todas las miradas constructivistas y una educación más tradicional, pues sí son muy conducentes a un tipo de educación en proyectos, a un tipo de educación en multiedad, donde se presenta muchísima diversidad, interdisciplinariedad y como posibilidad de indagación y de investigación sobre eso. Sin embargo, algo que siempre nos cuestiona a los educadores es el tema de la evaluación, cómo saber si los niños están logrando, digamos, todo el tema de conocimiento que hará más enriquecidos los networks que se formen, y al mismo tiempo cómo estamos motivando, cómo estamos creando el ambiente para lograr, digamos, las mentes creativas. ¿Podrías como comentarnos un poquito sobre el tema de la evaluación y de esa paradoja que se presenta necesariamente en lo que hacemos en educación?
So are you talking about evaluation from the perspective of the teacher evaluating the students? Or?
Yeah, y de la perspectiva desde la creatividad, cómo cambiar el scope a la evaluación hacia a la creatividad. ¿Es posible evaluar?
Oh, wow. I wish I knew. Yeah, I wish I knew. And I think, you know, from the Montessori study, again, this is was just one comparison between one type of school and a traditional. There's many other schooling practices and systems out there that it would be really interesting to know about. But I guess you could think about different aspects of Montessori, like you were saying, the kind of multi-age classroom, kind of self-directed learning that doesn't have as much direct feedback from the teachers. So I think that understanding maybe what's the best level of feedback to give. So like, you know, at one extreme end, you have, you know, lots of feedback all the time. At the other end, you have very minimal feedback. Maybe that's the Montessori based approach. But I think that is one piece of the puzzle that we can focus on, is what kind of feedback are we giving students in supporting their creative thinking skills. You know, at the end of the day, we want to have we want to be giving some kind of tests and evaluations so we could see how they're doing. And I think creativity is no different. You know, we have to kind of, if we want to get a measure of the students' thinking skills, we have to give them tests every once in a while. But I think, you know, the kind of feedback that you would give for creativity is maybe a little bit different than you would give for other type of learning, where you just have one correct answer, right? If the answer is right or wrong, that's very obvious. But I think there's ways, because creativity doesn't have right or wrong answers, you can focus on encouraging students to, for example, persist in coming up with ideas. So if they thought of some, they have some ideas, and they don't think they're any good, you can kind of focus in on encouraging them to continue to think more and to draw in other sources of inspiration. But I think, yeah, being specific about what are the influences of these factors, like evaluation, feedback environment, peer learning, those kind of things. There's so much more interesting research to do on that.
Gracias. De todas maneras, hay una inmensa relación entre el mindset que ayudamos a formar en los estudiantes y la pedagogía de la creatividad. ¿Podría comentar algo en esto? Y la parte emocional, ¿no? También hay varias preguntas sobre qué rol juega el desarrollo socioemocional en el tema de la creatividad.
So yeah, thank you for bringing up other very relevant factors that I have not had enough time to talk about today. So mindset is, as we know, like very important in different ways. And creative mindset actually has been a topic of increasing interest in the research field. How you can foster what's called creative self-efficacy. So as you mentioned already, there's students have self-concepts that are building, and they have different mindsets that are nurtured in the classroom. And what we don't want is for students to have the self-concept of, I'm not creative, I can't solve creative problems, or just thinking about creativity as something that is just for the arts, right? So if you can conceptualize creativity for students as something that they can all do, and it's not just for the artsy kids in the classroom, but everybody has ideas, everyone can kind of foster their own creative potential, then I think that's a good thing to focus on. But as you mentioned, also the social and emotional piece will be relevant as well. It's not something that I've studied as much, but I think that's we already know that, for example, positive emotion is important for creativity, and this kind of goes against the idea of the kind of creativity and having negative emotions, like the famous artists over the years that had, you know, difficulty with mental disorders and emotions. You know, there are definitely cases of those individuals, but the vast majority of the research indicates that positive emotion is important for fostering creativity. So the extent that can be brought into the classroom, I think that should be a promising direction.
Gracias. Me trae como a la mente que una de las grandes revoluciones, digamos, que hubo en educación fue toda la propuesta de Gartner acerca de las 6 inteligencias, etcétera, en el salón de clase. Y luego viene como todo este brain approach en educación. ¿Cómo ve usted ahí el cambio de una postura sobre 7 inteligencias y tipos de inteligencia, y ahorita esa mirada tan fuerte sobre el tema de networks, colaboración, el encuentro, digamos, de esas conexiones y esa cooperación casi en la misma, esa propuesta, digamos, colaborativa de pensamiento que usted hace a nivel de la biología misma y a nivel, digamos, de lo social, también el tema del aprendizaje colaborativo, la construcción colaborativa. ¿Podría comentar algo sobre eso?
Sure. So I do think that there's different, like, intelligence can be expressed in different ways, and that is, as you mentioned, the Garner's theory of multiple intelligences. The way I tend to think about the process, the kind of abilities and thinking styles relevant for creativity is that creativity is kind of at the top of what we can do, or kind of what our brain is doing is this kind of emergent property of a lot of other things that are working, right? We're expressing a creative idea, but as I mentioned earlier, that is coming from multiple sources. So from our memory, from our ability to kind of control what we're thinking about, to motivation, to emotion. So I think, I've presented a pretty narrow, like, or at least like one piece of what creative thinking can look like, but I would suggest that it is something that is informed by, so like creativity is at the top, and there's many other things that are related to it, like memory. So for example, if you can, as I mentioned earlier, have an impact on memory, if you could have changed the organization or have an influence on the organization of concepts, that's going to be one way to influencing creative thinking. But there's many others. It just depends on kind of what's the focus and what's the goal. So I hope that answered your question. But
no, pues pone también como le pone usted muchos temas para pensar, ¿no? Para mirar eso. Parte, digamos, que también del estudio de los modelos es el papel del ambiente para el aprendizaje. Han trabajado un poquito en los tipos de ambientes que hacen un poquito más de acompañamiento al tema de la creatividad en los diferentes salones de clase o en la misma universidad.
I myself have not done that kind of research beyond the school study that I had mentioned earlier. I think there is plenty of evidence, though, that there's different aspects of the environment, the school environment, the teacher's approach, and kind of how the classrooms are structured in different ways that encourage creativity, exploration, those kind of things. Again, it's not something that I have studied very much myself, but from the research I am familiar with, there is, definitely a role for the environment to play. And again, I want to talk about what my research has not really focused so much on that. It's kind of looking at different brain regions and how they correlate with people's creativity on one day, right? But that's just one snapshot. And there's other research indicating that there's different influences, that momentary influences on creativity. So you could have an influence just in the classroom in a single day, and that certain activities and exercises can draw out students' creativity. And you could look at that kind of at a longer scale of ways of setting up a curriculum, with setting up a classroom, training teachers, and those kind of environmental influences that really should have a sustained impact on creativity.
Muchas gracias. doctor Beaty, hay también otro montón de preguntas como profundizando un poquito en la relación entre memoria y creatividad, como cuál es el balance correcto, o si de pronto volviendo un poquito a una educación que le hace mucha fuerza a la memoria, a retener hechos y fechas, etcétera, de alguna manera es un paso importante a retomar, digamos, también una mirada de creatividad, como pues se podría aclarar un poquito cuál es esa proporción o qué papel jugó en sus estudios el tema de la memoria. Pues qué papel ya no lo explicó, pero en temas de proporción.
Yeah, something I would like to know and tell you a very simple answer to, but it's still to be determined. I think that, you know, if you want to, you know, speculate a little bit about what we're seeing with memory, and that it has to do with the organization, and there's probably a specific organization that is very helpful for rote memorization of facts and, like you said, dates and so forth, and having a very organized memory where you have a category for different things and they're all separate and distinct. So I think, you know, my guess so far is that if there is a way to connect what you're learning to what you already know in a new and different way. So in terms of you're learning something new, you're connecting it to what you already know, but maybe not what you know that is directly relevant. You know, sometimes that's a lot of what learning education is. You're going to, this is like that, and this is like using analogy and so forth. But if there's maybe a way to link new information to maybe not the most obvious connections that you might make to it. And also, so like, you know, memory is always going to be important. It's just kind of how is it important, and how can we potentially influence how students are thinking about new or learning new concepts and relating them to what they already know. And yeah, so I think there's so much important research to be done on this, and this is right now just my guess on what's the best way to go.
Sí, porque el centro, siento yo que en los profesores que están preguntando sobre ese tema, pues obviamente es el tema del balance entre el currículum estructurado, de las asignaturas, etcétera, y las oportunidades de creatividad, si son dos cosas diferentes, o cómo se podría hacer, digamos, una mirada, digamos, novedosa en relación con el juego entre el currículum y la creatividad.
Yeah, I think, you know, there's not an optimal balance that we know about yet. So I think what you could potentially see in the future in terms of the research that could be done on this is to kind of shuffle around the things that students are learning about. I mean, there's this idea of blocking versus interleaved learning. You know, if you're kind of learning things separately versus kind of blending them together, or blending together new concepts, that seems like a way that might be having an influence on how memory is organized. And so again, if you think about just the very typical way of learning, where you just kind of have one topic that you're studying, and all of the concepts go into that category. Maybe the review of information that you've learned, and kind of juxtaposing that against other things that you have learned or you're teaching, so that when it goes to the process of actually remembering that information, things are not just so neatly organized into, this is my one category for this, and this is my other category for that, but maybe you're already making some connections between those things just by reviewing things in a more varied way in terms of the content in the classroom.
Muchísimas gracias. Su conferencia nos abre un camino enorme de pensamiento, particularmente en el Colegio Hacienda Los Alcaparros, en esta celebración de sus 30 años con el tema de cerebro y creatividad. Pues hemos venido recorriendo el camino de encontrar ese punto medio, ese punto justo entre el conocimiento que los niños tienen que saber y que es importante que sepan, pero que de todas maneras abre el camino a las personas creativas que se han necesitado siempre en la historia de la humanidad y que en este momento son importantes. De manera que una investigación como la suya para mí es como una provocación para pensar, para remirar, para reestructurar y para compartir con ustedes lo que vamos hallando y lo que vamos viendo en las propuestas que han ido apareciendo en este cerebro creativo. Quiero darle las gracias de verdad de una manera muy cálida, porque creo que lo mejor que le puede pasar en la vida a un educador es que le abran nuevos caminos, porque los niños siempre son nuevos, los padres siempre son nuevos, los educadores tenemos que estarnos renovando y mirando en cuál es la mejor propuesta para las generaciones que tenemos en la mano. Una investigación como la suya es una investigación que realmente abre nuevos caminos para los educadores. Le agradezco muchísimo su presencia en este evento de Hacienda Los Alcaparros del cerebro creativo. Me encanta que venga a formar parte del grupo de científicos amigos del colegio que nos permiten mantenernos actualizados y mantenernos en una situación de vanguardia en el pensamiento. Y me gustaría muchísimo pues enviarles algunas de las observaciones, porque no son tanto investigaciones tan rigurosas como las que hacen ustedes en los laboratorios, pero son observaciones que vamos haciendo de nuestra propia práctica educativa, que seguramente cuando usted venga a Colombia a visitarnos, será muy interesante sentarnos a hablar sobre eso. Muchísimas gracias, doctor Beaty, por su conferencia y su generosidad en contestar todas estas preguntas muy amables.
Thank you, Rosa.
Entonces, dando las gracias al doctor Beaty, me queda agradecer a todas las personas que estuvieron presentes, a los maestros que enviaron tan interesantes preguntas que fui pues agrupando en los grandes temas que allí se mencionaban, y obviamente pues queda la invitación abierta para nuestra próxima conferencia el 5 de marzo a esta misma hora, a las 10 de la mañana. ¿Cuáles son las condiciones necesarias para la creatividad? Con la doctora Alina Puxley, y seguramente tendrán ustedes otro momento agradable, otra pildorita, otra para la creación, para acompañar en la formación a esta generación que ha vivido momentos tan complejos. Muchísimas gracias, y con esto pues terminamos la sesión de hoy sobre cerebro creativo. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias por acompañarnos en esta conferencia del coloquio El Cerebro Creativo. No olvide visitar nuestra página web www.alcaparros.edu.co para registrarse a la próxima charla a cargo de Lina Puxley, fundadora de Keeping Creativity Alive. ¿Cuáles son las condiciones necesarias para la creatividad? Y conocer más sobre el llamado global de ideas creativas presentada hoy. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos.